It's connecting.
I think we're live.
Okay, hello everyone. My name is James Ketterer. I'm the Dean of the School of Continuing Education at the American University in Cairo. And I just want to say a few things about our lecture series and the school in general before we begin the conversation with our guest today. Many of you are already part of the school's community, SCE as we call it, and you know us well, but some of you don't. And so for those of you who don't, I just want to say that we are not an afterthought. We're not a recent development. The American University in Cairo has been in existence for 101 years, which is in American terms, a long time. In Egyptian terms, it's the blink of an eye. And, but for most of that time, there has been some version of continuing education that's been at the heart of the mission of the university. And that is really noteworthy, and it's not common for American universities to have dated back to all that time. 1924 is the beginning of the school. And I think that's important because it shows that there's great importance placed on what we do. And what we do is to reach out to the broad swath of Egyptian society and well beyond the borders of Egypt to deliver high quality AUC level education in an accessible, affordable, and useful way to many, many different people. And we define useful in all sorts of ways. And it really, we let the people who are coming to us define it for themselves. We want to offer what's as much as we can and what is in keeping with the mission and the values of the university. So that might be English language courses, it might be courses in Arabic, it might be courses for career development. Increasingly, it might be courses for enrichment and lifelong learning, vocational education, translation, and on and on and on. It's really, I think, an exciting place. It's a place where we can experiment with new ideas and find new audiences who are interested in what we do. And that, I think, is very much in keeping with the work of our guest today, Dr. Mona Morshed, who comes to us. She's the founding CEO of Generation, and she'll talk more about what that organization does. She's widely published on topics having to do with the relationship between education and employment. She has worked for McKinsey Company, global social responsibility and education issues. She serves on the board of some very important organizations. And I should say also has a connection to AUC, and that she participated in the Center for Arabic Study Abroad. So we claim her as one of our alums, and proudly so. So Dr. Morshed, thank you very much for agreeing to be with us today.
Thank you.
And I look forward to the conversation. I should also say that we're on Facebook Live, and that if people want to ask questions when we get to the question and answer period in a while, then please put them in the comments, and those will be directed to us, and I'll get a sense of what they are, and I'll ask as many as I can. I'm sure I think there are already questions being lined up. So we'll talk for a while, then we'll go to questions and answers. And so let's start the conversation. I was so interested to learn about the work of Generation, because this relationship between education and employment seems to me one that is fraught on both sides of that equation. And that there are, I hear in my job, constant concerns, sometimes real complaints from the employment side, either with people trying to get employment or with employers who are trying to get what they need, about the kind of education that people are getting. And then on the education side, there's a sense, I think all too often, that it should be purely education for education's sake, and it should somehow be only loosely tied to people's aspirations in the world of work. And it seems to me that that's dysfunctional in both directions. And it also seems to me that your work personally and the work of your organization are trying to get at the heart of that difficult relationship between these two worlds. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about what the organization does and how you ended up on this path yourself to do this work.
Terrific. And thank you for the invitation to join you today. So the tension that you described is real and it's global, right? And so you often get the sense of you have this happening, right? So employers are blaming the education and training institutions are blaming the employers, and then you have the learners sitting in the middle, like they're in the eye of the storm. And they often feel that they've done all the right things. They've gone to school, they've studied, they've graduated, and yet there is no job. There is no income on the other side of that equation. So we created Generation to precisely address this issue. And so Generation is a global employment nonprofit. We launched about 6.5 years ago. And our goal is to try to fix that gap such that we recruit, train, and place learners into careers that would otherwise have been beyond their reach. And essentially what we're seeking to do is to first and foremost pre-confirm the job vacancies so that we know that the jobs are there before we then train and place learners into those roles. And in particular, when you look across the space, often it's the reverse, right? So education and training happens, and then there's the sequence where supposedly employment will happen thereafter. So we're flipping the sequence. And I think increasingly, given what we're seeing in the world, more education and training institutions will have to do that in order to support employment outcomes. So what we seek to do is, so first we pre-confirm the vacancies. We work across 15 countries now and 30 professions, everything from tech to healthcare to customer service to skilled trades. We then recruit learners, and we're specifically recruiting learners who have different profiles than what employers typically say they want, right? So if they typically say, look, we only want people with a science or engineering background, we will deliberately go out and find those with a liberal arts background and support them to be able to enter these roles. If it's professions where there's very low representation in terms of gender or in terms of ethnic orientation or identity, we will specifically go out and try to address that and so on. And then our learners experience a 4 to 12 week boot camp that is profession specific. And we're supporting them to learn the activities that they will have to be able to do on a daily basis once they are in that profession. And we are focused on supporting them with the technical skills, the behavioral skills, the mindsets that they need so that they can perform that job at a high level from their first day on the job. Once they complete the program, they interview with our employer partners. And then once they're on the job, we track the return on investment. So what that means is for our employers, it's the cost per hire, it's the productivity outcomes, it's the quality outcomes, it's the speed to promotion. And for our learners, it's the personal and financial well-being. And the reason why we do that is you have to show that this actually creates value for people. It has to create value for the employers and it has to create value for the learners. Otherwise, what's the point? And then we use data to support all of our activities so that we get better every time. So we now have an 83% job placement rate within 3 months of program completion. Our graduates typically earn 3 to 4 times, in some cases 5 to 6 times as much as they were earning before Generation. But it's fundamentally geared on bridging the gap between education and employment, and to do it quickly.
One of the things that you mentioned in bridging that gap is something that hadn't occurred to me until you were just talking about it, and that is what employers think they want and what employers might in fact need in a particular position. I've been struck over the years when I have been teaching and advising undergraduate students when they graduate and go out into the working world. They are confronted with a wide variety of different kinds of job postings, And more, it seems to me that these job postings are written by massive committees that kind of throw everything in there that may or may not have any relevance to the job itself. And I think it's unrealistic for the employers and probably a very inefficient way to go about it. So do you and your team, you have conversations with these employers to try to calibrate those job postings and their expectations in a way that match reality, or open up the door for liberal arts students when they didn't think that they would want them, or maybe not even have a full understanding of what the liberal arts are?
Absolutely. We learned very early on in Generation that if you go and you ask employers, what is it that you're looking for? You will either get a list of 2 things or a list of 50 things, and neither of these are helpful, right? So we don't actually engage in that discussion. We engage in a discussion about what's your pain point, right? So as an employer, like, what is not working, right? So are you facing scarcity issues? Are you facing high churn issues? Are you facing productivity variation issues? So what's the business problem you're facing? And then we spend several days just observing employees in that target profession to understand what their activities are on a daily basis. And it's on the basis of those observations that we then create a map. We call it our activity map that says, okay, if you're a digital marketer, these are the 20 things that you do in your day. And for those activities, which are the ones that really drive productivity and quality outcomes? And it's typically a subset. It's typically not all 20. It'll be like more like five things that you do. And then we deeply seek to understand, okay, what is it that differentiates between a high performer in doing those activities and a lower performer? That then becomes the basis for our curriculum. So it's not on the, so it's activity first, skill second. And that might seem like a nuance, but if you think of it this way, an employer may say, hey, I want problem solving. Great. But what does problem solving mean? It has to be in a technical context. So what does problem solving look like when you're a digital marketer and you're trying to figure out what's the cost benefit trade-off of a campaign, right? Or if you're coding, or if you're a nurse assistant, and what does problem solving look like? Because you have to also think of patient safety. And so you have to understand skills in the context of specific activities, of specific roles. And I think that's what we very much orient our employers towards. And that's what enables us to take what might otherwise be in a traditional education or training institution, a program that spans a year, and turn it into something that can actually be 3 months, because of that laser focus on what are the activities you must do flawlessly in order to be highly productive and to be a tremendous value-added hire to that employer. And that's the discussion that we have with our employers, as opposed to what are you looking for?
That also makes me think, though, that that feedback loop that you're talking about has a lot to do with the initial job that the learner goes into, and that makes a great deal of sense in that regard. But at AUC and at other universities that take the liberal arts very seriously, and there are many, there is a sense too that you're educating students to be able to be flexible and resilient, so that they can also find a way to flourish in their next job and the third job and the fourth job, because this is the nature of work in the era in which we live. That the old days when people would start with one company and then continue on till retirement and the gold watch with that company are fewer and fewer. And so I know you're only 6+ years into this, but I think it'll be interesting to see the data as it's generated over the course of the student's lifetime, the learner's lifetime, particularly because at SCE and I think at Generation, we're not just focused on traditional students that finish a degree at the age of 22 go out into the workforce, and maybe they come back for a graduate degree or maybe not, that we really are in the business of lifelong learning. And so how does that translate into what generation does and how you train people?
So that question has always been very central to us, right? So you need to get someone into a job, but the reality is that it's not just a job. You need to think about their entire career. And as you just noted, for this generation, they could be in 6, 7, 8, 9 jobs over the course of their career. It's not just one job. So we tackle this on two fronts. So one is, I had mentioned that we're really teaching three things in our bootcamp. So there's the technical skills, there are the mindsets, and then there are the behaviors. And so the mindsets are things like persistence and forward orientation, which is your ability to make a plan and to check your progress against that plan. And so, so we have multiple mindsets and behaviors, although we're teaching the behaviors in a technical context, that are really important to support you to move from, I am a digital marketer today, and I could actually decide to be a Java developer tomorrow or a Python developer or whatever it might be. So we're quite mindful that we have to lay a foundation. But I would also say that's for our youth, but we also serve learners who are age 40 plus. And our age 40 plus learners have actually already had careers in many cases, but they lost their jobs either due to the pandemic or due to automation or digitization, or they've been caregivers for the last 10 years and are coming back into the job market. And so for them, it's actually, we're actually creating an encore career, if you will, right? So they've been working in logistics and now they want to work in tech or whatever it might be. And so we're also finding that the work that we do on mindsets and behaviors, in addition to the technical skills, is crucial for them to successfully integrate into what might already now be their 6th job or their 5th job at this point in their career. So these two, nothing is binary. I mean, obviously, you can't, people are not creating something that just fits into this particular piece. But we're very mindful that these are concentric circles, right? There's technical skills, there's mindsets, there's behaviors, and you have to have all of them to support someone to do well in the first step and to move successfully to the second step.
With the work that you're doing and the things that you just said was making me think about the traditional culture of universities in general. And I know you're working around the world, but I think one thing that's consistent about universities, no matter what country they're in, is that these are places that tend to, for good reasons, in many cases, move slowly, thoughtfully. Curricula, degree programs, et cetera, are already in place, and adjusting them takes a long time and takes convincing lots of different groups of stakeholders. I'm wondering, to the extent that you work in coordination with universities, or you find that to do the things that Generation does and accomplish the goals that you are accomplishing, that you, to put it bluntly, have to circumvent a lot of those hidebound traditions.
So there's no question that given the changes in the job market, and the pandemic just accelerated that even more so, there is a level of agility that is required in order to look at what's happening in the job vacancies and to bring forward programs, right? Particularly if you look at tech professions, they might, they go through changes every 6 months. They have to be updated every 6 months because of the technology itself changing that they're using, or the coding language, or whatever it might be. That being said, we made a decision a few years ago that if we are going to be a part of the solution, then we have to be able to work successfully with existing education and training institutions and public systems, so vocational systems, whereby we can partner with governments and embed our practices and what we've learned, and also, but doing that in a way that works with whatever is the government context. And so we have actually been able to partner in that way, from India to Kenya to Singapore to the US. And we're very excited to do that because part of our mission is we want to obviously serve our learners. We want to be a great program and organization, but we also want to be great system shapers. And that can only come from finding ways to work very closely with public institutions in this space.
Well, I just want to follow up my own question too with saying, in defense of my own university, we do have many units, including the School of Continuing Education, that are designed to be agile and to respond quickly to whether it's market forces or interest from different constituencies, and that there are other parts of the university that are purposely designed to kind of adhere to a long-standing tradition in their discipline. So I think it's that balance that really can be healthy for an institution. But Generation is working around the world in some really very widely differing contexts. How much are you finding that your work has to really change from place to place that you go to, and what things are just kind of consistent and maybe have even surprised you in their consistency globally?
Yeah, so when we started Generation, we very deliberately started in 5 countries simultaneously. So we started in India, Mexico, Kenya, Spain, and the US when we launched our operations in 2015. And we did that because we wanted to learn what is universal and what is context specific. The only way you can do that is by going through the same experience across, in multiple places. So what stayed consistent is that Generation has 7 steps. Those 7 steps are absolutely universal across all of our countries. And so the 7 steps of we pre-confirm job vacancies, we recruit our learners, we have the boot camp, we offer social support services, we place our learners into jobs, we track the data, and so on. So those 7 steps, 100% universality. And the reason is, particularly for our target learner, it requires those 7 steps. This is not training alone. Like training, I often say training is one of 7 things that we do. If all we did was the training, we would not have the outcomes that we have, right? So the 7 steps are fully consistent. How we execute those 7 steps does vary by country. So for recruiting, in some countries, we can just use social media to do nearly 100% of our recruiting in terms of bringing candidates to us. In other countries, we actually have to go door to door, or it's a much more hands-on campaign. In some countries, the boot camp part happens in actual, it's happening online now, but it could be deeply in partnership with government providers, and others it might happen in partnership with nonprofits. So we have the how varies, the what is fully consistent. And I think we had that hypothesis when we started Generation, and we're actually delighted to see that 30 professions and 15 countries later, that continues to be the case.
Given the way that you were just talking about that, I mean, setting this up in a comparative way, generating this data across a variety of cases, you just said this was your hypothesis. I'm wondering the extent to which you are thinking of or already doing, taking this data and not only using it to, as you said before, learn more about what works with different programs, different contexts, but also turning it into studies that would resonate within the scholarly world about educational issues. I mean, you really have the perfect elements of a comparative study underway. And I'm wondering the extent to which you or others that you're working with are also working with those in the scholarly world about this sort of thing. Because in my experience, and the reason I ask this, I guess, with a purpose, is that I think the field of continuing education, training, et cetera, has a real focus on kind of real world outcomes, and it's a bit underdeveloped. I don't want to do an injustice to it, but it's a bit underdeveloped in terms of looking at ourselves as a scholarly entity as well, and turning that into studies.
So we are very excited to be engaged in research of that kind. So we now have 43,000 graduates across our countries, and we track data from the application stage, so those whom we accepted, those not, the performance in the boot camp, and the performance on the job. And once they're on the job, we track our learners, at 3 months, at 6 months, at a year, etc. So across all these things, we now have over 7 million data points, and growing, as you can imagine. And so we have begun doing our own predictive analytics to understand what's really driving what, but we're also now going to be engaged in third-party impact assessment in 2 of our countries. I think this is an area where we want to do much more because, like you just said, I mean, we actually, I think, have a relatively unique data set in terms of, it's a single methodology across multiple countries, multiple population segments. And our fervent wish is to be able to leverage this for the good of the field and practice overall.
Well, let me change topics just a little bit before we go to the question and answer period, and maybe set up the Q&A section with a broader question, and that is, so for those who are part of this conversation today, who are listening on Facebook Live, and who are in a country where generation is not working, what, based upon so much work that you've done personally, and the writing and the thinking you've been doing about this, there's a learner of whatever age who's unhappy with their current situation or wants to do something more interesting or whatever. What kind of general advice would you give them? What sorts of things should they be thinking about when they're at, coming out of the pandemic, maybe feeling very, very frustrated and concerned about their prospects?
Yeah, and well, the reality is that there are many people coming out of the pandemic who are feeling that way. So whether you are unemployed or whether you are employed and want to switch careers, my greatest counsel is to find a program that will train and place you in a job, not just train you. Because the reality is that getting trained alone, particularly when you do not have a background or a history in whatever is the target profession that you're seeking to get into, without a network to enable you to be placed, it can be enormously challenging, because you will typically not look like what employers would normally hire under traditional circumstances. And in an environment where we now have a lot more people who are unemployed or considering switching, employers are being even choosier than they are typically. And so they're looking for people with even more experience and with even greater track record and so on. And so find a program in whatever city you're in that will train and place you. Do not just take the program that will train you alone.
Yeah, I think that is understandable. It's clear advice, but I think it's probably a challenge too, because it's a model that you really are developing anew and doesn't exist in as many places as it should and could. So I think your message is, I put it to you for job seekers, but the message could just as easily resonate with potential employers and for institutions such as our own at the School of Continuing Education to kind of think long and hard about what we do. I mean, it seems like we're at this point where, because it was, so much was prompted by the pandemic that we had to kind of rethink, now is a time for us to rethink our own relationship between training, education, and the world of work. And so that's, I think your advice is good advice for anyone who's listening, including yours truly, who has much to learn from this. Do you have, maybe you could just, for people listening in, tell us what countries you're working in, and if you have others that or if you're thinking of expanding into other places?
Yeah, so here's the list of the 15. All right, hoping I don't miss anyone. Okay, so I'll start in Europe. So UK, Ireland, Spain, Italy, France, Kenya, India, Pakistan, Singapore, Hong Kong, and we'll soon be launching in Thailand. And then Mexico, Brazil will be launching soon in Chile and Colombia, and the US.
And I see from that list that there's also a wide variety of experiences that those different countries have had during the pandemic. How was your work affected by it? And were there times in which you had to kind of rethink the work of generation, not just to get through the pandemic, but were there things that came up during this time, this very challenging time, that made you think, well, maybe we should do X, Y, and Z things differently?
There were many such moments. I just mentioned that Italy is one of our countries, and as you recall, it was one of the hardest hit by the pandemic. It was one of the earliest hit and hardest hit by the pandemic. So that was in February of 2020, and we immediately began thinking about, well, what if we could deploy our curriculum and instruction resources to creating trainings for healthcare staff, so nurses, doctors, other clinicians, on how to treat and care for COVID patients. Because if you'll recall, like, this all happened very fast. Like what typically hospitals and healthcare workers had were like dry PowerPoint manuals. And so we very quickly began creating videos where we would find a star nurse in many cases, or a star doctor, who would actually go through, in about 6 of our countries, and they would go through and say, okay, so here's what you do on infection control. Here's how you protect yourself. Here's how you put on PPE. Here's what happens when there's a tear, and just very practical guidance. So we ended up supporting about 260,000 healthcare workers across 6 countries over the course of last year as this was happening. And so that was one thing that we did not have on our radar screen at all to do, but felt that it was an important part of contributing to our community. For our learners, several things happened. I mean, one, we obviously, like much of the world, pivoted to teaching online. Initially, this was teaching online over Zoom, what we were teaching before in person. We have now since then literally created programs from scratch that are designed to be delivered 100% online, or in some cases blended. And so, and that's not going back, right? So we will never again, in all likelihood, have programs that are 100% in person as a result of this. Other changes were about just because the job, I mean, you will notice that, last year job vacancies plummeted massively relative to what they were pre-pandemic. So we use now a lot more job post scrape data, which tells us, like, on a daily basis where are the vacancies, so that we can, literally on a daily, weekly basis make decisions about, do we launch this cohort, do we not? Do we, where do we mobilize the jobs, and so on. So those are some of the changes that have happened. Some things that we never imagined doing, and some things that we hopefully are doing better now and sets us up well for the future.
Yeah, that certainly aligns with our experience at the School of Continuing Education, where before the pandemic, we had some blended courses, but it was a modest number at best. And, we've moved a huge number of our offerings online in a variety of different ways. And now even exploring more ways, beyond the kind of, just presenting what we do in the classroom, but doing it online with the use of virtual reality, exploring gamification, fully online courses for a global audience. One that's being designed by one of our star professors at AUC will dig into all the things that make Cairo such an interesting city and present it to a global audience. And we hope that some of the people who will take this fully online class will then want to come for a follow-up experience in Cairo in person. But we know that the numbers of that will be very small. So for those who just aren't able to do that, they can still get a sense of why Cairo is such a fascinating place, beyond the pyramids. The pyramids obviously are one of the wonders of the world, but there's a lot more going on in Cairo on a daily basis. And historically, we want to capture all of that. And how can we do that in a compelling way online? And, in our experience, it was a learning process for us, but it was also a learning process in how to, for our students, some issues of technology, but some issues of just expectations, and getting beyond the initial sense that, well, online just couldn't possibly be as good. As we return to face-to-face, as it is with Generation, we'll continue to do online, and we'll continue to find new audiences and learners beyond Cairo and our two campuses in Cairo who never could or would come to us in person. So I think it's really very exciting. Necessity definitely has been the mother of invention for us, and I think for many, many people. And we've had to rethink a lot of things about the way we do and what works and what doesn't. It's really been a trial and error era for us as well. Let me just look and see if I have any questions here. We do have one question about how one audience member is asking how can they best search for a training and placement project? I mean, I guess to the advice that you gave before, what would be a good starting point for them in a country where Generation's not currently working?
Yeah, so if you have a clear view on which types of professions you're targeting, so let's say you want to do tech careers or whatever it might be, or if you decide you want to go into healthcare careers. So begin by searching for programs that will support you in whether it's healthcare or tech, but then do two things. One, look to see if they cite employment statistics, so what actually is the employment rate coming out of that program? And if they have a list of the employers that their graduates go to. If you don't see those things, then have a conversation. And if you don't hear about them, then it's not likely that they've got that, right? So that's the way I would suggest to do the diligence. The other part, for example, you might have a perspective about which employer you want to go after. Try to understand where they typically recruit their learners from, right? Or sorry, their new hires from. But essentially, whenever you are looking at a training program, if you're not seeing employment statistics, if you're not seeing employer logos of where learners are going, immediately begin asking a series of questions so that you can understand what kind of employer ecosystem this training provider or the education provider has. And if you don't get compelling answers to that, then move on to the next one.
That's very clear advice, and I think the moving on to the next one is I think is tough for particularly some younger learners who are recently in the job market and kind of hang on to one specific idea, and the idea that sometimes you just have to move on and move on to the next opportunity, or maybe rethink how you're calibrating where you want to work and what you want to do. Is really valuable advice. It's easier said than done, but it's really important. Let me ask another question that has to do with the other areas that you are involved in. So I know that you're a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. And for those of you in this call who don't know, this is, one of the, it's a private organization, but it deals with American foreign policy largely, but international issues in general at a very high level, sort of high politics, grand strategy, et cetera. Traditionally, they do this, not exclusively. But I'm wondering to what extent you have been able to get more of a hearing for the kinds of issues that you're focused on as an important element of international affairs, and whether it's the formulation and implementation of U.S. foreign policy or an understanding of, well, what's really important when we think about the international system at this particular moment. My experience is that I think when people are presented with the kind of data that you have, they're really interested, but they don't often come across it in their regular reading or in the regular sorts of meetings that they go to. It really has to be kind of presented anew and in a way that is really compelling and it connects with those broader grand strategy issues that they're thinking about.
So we try very much to leverage our data to be able to present and share perspectives that for policymakers can be used to improve the way the workforce system or the education to employment system in their particular country could function more effectively, right? So for example, today Generation happens to be releasing the findings of global research that we just conducted on the age 45 plus population across 7 of the countries where we operate. And we actually did a survey of unemployed age 45 plus who had successfully switched careers, unemployed youth and other mid-career, so ages 18 to 34, excuse me, ages 18 to 44, and employers, right? So we were able to bring this group together in a survey that typically you don't have such a broad diversity of perspectives. And frankly, for the age 45 plus population, there's actually relatively little global research on the employment challenges that they face. So one of the findings that, many of us have always suspected that, ageism is alive and rampant, but what we were able to do with this research is actually put a number on it, right? So when we asked employers their perspective, and so this is employers across the 7 countries, their perspectives on the relative strengths of different age brackets, employers found no strengths for the age 45 plus population relative to the younger age brackets, right? Only 15% of employers would say that they actually found that the age 45 plus were fit for purpose. But when you turned around and asked, okay, well, of the age 45 plus that you've hired for entry level or intermediate roles, what is their performance? Actually, for 87% of the 45 plus whom they'd hired, they said that they performed as well, if not better, than their younger peers. And they said that 90% of them would, had retention potential that was as good, if not better, than their younger peers. So this is a case where, the reality is wildly different from the perception that employers have when they initially see a job candidate who is 45 plus. And so it's that kind of juxtaposition of perspectives that we think is most important to bring to bear and to shine a light on, in addition to our program experience, to support policymakers to think differently about how we actually support this population. Because with that fact base, the job prospects, the employment prospects for the age 45 plus population should be much better than what it is today. In many countries, the majority of the long-term unemployed are age 45 plus. and yet we have this fact base. So these are the types of things that we try to share in the hope of triggering different ways of thinking about how systems operate.
Yeah, I mean, that's really compelling. And because you have the data to support it, you're not just saying like, oh, ageism is a terrible thing and one ought not to engage in it. And I think everyone would nod along knowingly. But then when you present them with this divergent data on what expectations are and what the reality is, and all that you just said, that really puts some specificity to it that can be used by policymakers, whether it's local departments of labor or industry organizations, et cetera, or organizations like yours. But also, I would hope that this would get the attention of the people at places like the U.S. Agency for International Development, and now being led by Ambassador Samantha Power. And that as they think about how to project American programs, development programs around the world, that they would say, well, we ought to try to integrate some of this, just as an example. I'm just using the US as one example, but it could be any country that's engaged in this, that would, think long and hard about that population of 45 plus learners who are also job seekers or job changers or what have you. I think it's, that's really crucially important. And it's not so easy to get the information to the right decision makers, but it's a lot easier if there's real data to support it. So that's really very, very interesting. Well, you had mentioned the countries that you're working in already, and when things calm down coming out of the pandemic and your work expands, maybe you could tell us what countries you're thinking about. And if you can't tell us that, well, what sorts of places beyond those 15, what kinds of criteria do you think about when you think about going into a new country?
Yeah, so for us, the criteria is really important, right? So the first and foremost, we're looking for employer demand. So employers have to have a pain point on the business side in order for them to hire differently than the way they traditionally hire, right? Like if everything's going great, then you're not going to change your behavior, right? So we search for that first and foremost, right? So as I mentioned, whether they're having scarcity issues or churn issues or variation of performance issues, et cetera. So that's the first thing that we look for. We then look at the ecosystem, so the education to employment ecosystem in the country, and figure out how we can add value to that. And that is, as I mentioned, it's always about how we can partner with some subset of that ecosystem. Because we never want to set up new community infrastructure. Like we would much rather partner with existing organizations and work with them and through them to be able to affect the system where they've been based. And then obviously because we're a nonprofit, we also have to figure out where the funding is going to come from to support the entire enterprise. And for us, funding, it could be philanthropic, it could be from government, it's also payment by employers and so on. So we figure out that equation. And then that's what determines where we go next. But as you noted, I mean, we obviously slowed down our expansion during the pandemic for the obvious reasons. But we are keen to support youth across the world and learners of all ages. And particularly now, with the research that we've just done on the age 45 plus population, we've served about 800 of our 43,000 learners, about 800 or so are age 45 plus or age 40 plus, excuse me. And we're increasingly keen to support this population across the world.
Very good. Let me see if we have any other questions right now. We don't. I'm just wondering, while we see if other people want to weigh in, and I want to encourage people to weigh in with your own questions. I can continue to ask questions for a very long time.
Or I can ask you questions. We can
yeah, please. Feel free. Yes. I hope I have a good answer. Go ahead.
No, I mean, so what do you think about the potential for train in place in Egypt at this time, based on the experience that the center's had? And how also do you think about building an employer ecosystem in the context of the center? And I mean, so what efforts do you have underway or that you are planning to do in order to
Well,
create that
I mean,
ecosystem?
one of the programs that we have, a department that we have, our Applied Services Division, which is working with people who are coming from really diverse backgrounds and diverse work experiences, and are often they're working for a company for a long time, but they've reached a point at which they cannot advance in their careers because they're perceived as not having the right credentials, the right degrees, et cetera. And the person who oversees this department has worked with these companies to devise programs and deliver them that within those companies, then I think create new pipelines for promotion, for advancement, and for career fulfillment that didn't exist before. And it's not quite the same model that you're talking about at Generation, where you have someone who's unemployed or maybe wants to just totally change what they do and go to a different company. So this is sort of intra company to do it. But I think that it has really opened up eyes both for the employees and the employers about what's possible for people who may have been seen as having kind of topped out from sort of a traditional definition. To us, I mean, those numbers are relatively small. You know, Egypt is a big country, and like any country has really diverse and pressing employment needs. But I think that gives us a sense that there's a real opportunity for employing that model. And I mean, based upon the conversation that we're having today, I can tell you that I'm definitely going to go back and talk to the Dean's Council and others in the school and see, how else can we work to set up some version of this model. Again, as I said, for us to take the advice that you were giving job seekers as people who are delivering continuing education to Egyptians and others, how can we also do this? And I'm thinking also that we might be able to work with, for instance, the American Chamber of Commerce in Egypt, which has close ties with the American University. And, can we work with them and start to have these sorts of conversations and see how we could expand this sort of approach that we're doing on a small scale and do it more along the lines of what you're talking about. What I think would also be really of interest to me personally and would take us in a different direction is to also start to collect and to analyze the kind of data that you're talking about. I find that really very, very interesting. And there are different kinds of versions of continuing education across the Middle East and North Africa, but it's not so prevalent and so kind of coherent as it is in the United States and some other places, which says to me that's a real opportunity for AUC to convene some interesting meetings and some cooperative work projects and data collection and things across those different schools. So it's not just AUC doing it, but we're doing it in a collegial, scholarly way with others. It's been something I've wanted to do since I arrived at AUC, some version of it 2 years ago, but obviously the pandemic happened and we've been busy doing other things, but I think we need to get back to that. I really find the work that you're doing in that regard very compelling. And I think as a university, we need to be doing more of that. We need to be doing more of it with other university colleagues who are engaged in the same kind of work. So yeah, the model makes a lot of sense to me and see where we could apply it, but also the model of the placement, but also the data collection and analysis, I think is tremendously important. And we are very good at collecting all sorts of data. So I think if we just kind of redirect our efforts in certain ways, we've already got the mechanisms in place. So that I think that makes it kind of exciting too, at least for a methodology wonk like me. It's exciting to do that. I think we might have another question here. So we have one who's asking about scholarships and what are the fields of studying and working. So about scholarships, I can just say that we do regularly advertise scholarships that are available at the School of Continuing Education at AUC. So you should continue to monitor our social media and that please, just stay in touch. This is something we regularly do, and we regularly are offering these sorts of opportunities. I can also say that many people assume because we're AUC that our courses are very, very expensive, and that is not the case at the School of Continuing Education. It's a key part of our mission for accessibility and affordability. So if you haven't gone to our website and explored what's available, you might be very pleasantly surprised at how affordable they are. But if you're still looking for scholarships, please do continue to monitor that. I'm not sure I fully understand the other part of the question, what are the fields for studying and working? Dr. Morshed, I think you may have applied, you may have answered that before, but go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, so for generation, we have 30 professions that span tech, healthcare, customer service, and skilled trades. And, so like in tech, we have now about 10 plus professions. We're also going to be launching a set of green professions, which we're very excited about, and which our organization overall is extremely excited about. So those are essentially, it's wherever there is significant employer demand, that's what causes us to open up a new profession.
Okay. Someone else is asking a very straightforward question, which is, you mentioned this report that was just released today. Where could they find this information?
Yeah, so if you, I don't know, is the chat feature available to me? So I'll just put it in the chat. But if you go to generation.org/midcareer, then you'll find it. But I'll just put it in the chat, and perhaps that could be sent out to those who participated today.
Yes, yeah, I think we can send that out on Facebook Live. We have time for just a couple of more questions. One person is asking about changing professions, and this can be, particularly challenging. This is, I think, one of those situations where context matters, at least in my experience. I think different countries, different societies are more open to job changers than others. And so for someone who majors in something and then wants to go into a different profession, they can often find lots of doors that are closed to them. And, what kind of advice would you give to someone who's, seeking a pretty major change in their direction in terms of their profession?
Yeah, and so there are two cases. There are those who studied something and then there are just no jobs in that, or very few jobs. And then there are those who have been working in an entirely different career for, let's say, the past 10 years, and now that job is gone and they need to shift to a new career. So we manage both cases. And what's most important is, we call it fire in the belly. But how hungry are you for an opportunity to change your life, to enter a new career, to create financial independence for yourself, for your family? And we now can show with our data that, those that are highest on fire in the belly are the ones that are powering through the boot camp. They're, and they're first to be employed and so on. So when I say, it's your behaviors and your mindsets, that is part of it. And so it's conviction and commitment to it. So you cannot do something halfway, right? So if you're going to switch, you have to switch. And what that means is that you may be starting at an entry level in whatever is the new career, as opposed, and maybe you were in an intermediate level in whatever was your former career. But if you're hungry, then you will propel faster, you will get promoted faster and so on. So it's commitment and it's hunger. These are the two things that will push you forward.
That's certainly very good advice for many things in life, and certainly in job seeking and job changing. Let me just ask one last thing. I'm going to combine a couple of these questions into one last question as we wrap up. And that one of them was about, we covered it a little bit, about generation working with educational institutions in the various countries. And the other one has to do with, can you basically be a smart person and well-read and well-trained, but you lack the kind of proper degrees. And so I would combine that into saying do you think that we've entered an era where it's less important that one has the kind of traditional degree track that used to be so important? That if we look at people like the two that I hear often cited, Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, college dropouts, they have been extraordinarily successful. Does the degree matter so much? Is it really more about the fire in the belly, the ability to learn and to continuously learn? Where do you see that landing as we enter what appears to be a new era that is upon us?
So I'll just share what we hear from employers, right? When you talk to tech employers, for example, your degree doesn't matter so much. What matters is your ability to do the job, right? So it's, can you code, can you design, whatever it is, can you actually do that? And the way you demonstrate that you can do that, increasingly you find employers using demonstration-based interviews as opposed to sitting across a table and let's talk about your CV. Right? So it's about, so now if you're in healthcare, you must know, and in order to be, so you will have to at least achieve a certification in most cases. You may, and so therefore there must have been a course that enables you to achieve certification for whichever that healthcare profession is, because that's a national or a local regulatory standard. So as is always the case, there is no single answer for all professions, but absolutely we see employers seeking to do more demonstration-based interviews and assessments. And we see the type of degree in some cases being lifted, but in other cases, and you'll see this in the research, we actually see that the bar has gone up in terms of the amount of experience that you need to have, in terms of, we want you to have the bachelor's or the master's or whatever it is. So there is no single answer to that. It really does depend on which profession are you going in.
Yeah, I mean, I have found that when people like Steve Jobs or Bill Gates are used as the example, these are obviously extraordinarily
Phenomenal
successful
examples.
people. Right,
Phenomenal examples,
but
right?
certainly outliers in many ways. In my experience, and again in guiding recent graduates over the past many years, is that the bar is being raised, and I think sometimes, and this is back to the question of what are employers expecting and is it unrealistic? I think too much so. I mean, it's almost like a filtering device or something, and it's not really relevant to actually doing the job. Well, that having been said, our time is up, and I want to thank you, Dr. Morshed, for your time and your wisdom, and I want to thank you and your team for all the work that you're doing. I mean, I think we are fellow travelers. The School of Continuing Education and Generation, we're working on very, very similar things, and I'm every day more and more convinced as to how important and how relevant it is for the time that we're living in. And so thank you very much for all of that. We'll certainly share the information about this new and very compelling report that you've just put out. And we look forward to continuing to find a way to work with you. And we're always happy to have back an AUC alum to our fold, even if it's virtually. We look forward to seeing you in Cairo sometime soon.
Inshallah. And thank you so much for the invitation, and thank you for all the terrific work which you're engaged in, and very much looking forward to staying in touch with the community.
Okay, thank you very much. And with that, we'll see you soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.